An American kidnapped and threatened with
word
death by
on an American journalist held hostage.
Micah Garen, a photographer from New York, was taken hostage by a splinter group.
Insurgent hideouts and going
abducted from this marketplace.
And so it's kind of like this, everything is happening in a matter of seconds, or it's so much is happening at once. People are shouting, people are getting involved. My translator was speaking a mile a minute, trying to keep everyone calm, doing his best to de-escalate. I was doing my best to try to disappear, get out of there as quickly as possible, because I was the source of this problem for everybody. The anger was all beginning, focusing on me. But it was one of those things that compounds itself.
Iraq. It's the summer of 2004. The U.S.-led coalition was fighting a war on two fronts: the Sunni insurgency in the north and the Shiite uprising in the south, led by Muqtada al-Sadr. It was also during that extraordinarily hot summer that the coalition transitioned authority back to an ill-trained, ill-equipped, and unprepared Iraqi security force, a move that created a void of power in the region that insurgents, outlaw gangs, and fundamentalists quickly filled. The country of Iraq was spiraling into chaos.
People rush over to see what the problem is, and the anger and the fear, the hostility, it all just builds on itself. And you could tell that, there's nothing, it would make no difference to anyone to kill somebody in that moment. It's not like that is something that they're concerned about in that moment. You're talking about a war zone, and they're concerned that I am, somebody who is an enemy. That's what they're thinking in their heads suddenly, like, who is this guy? What's going on? And so killing your enemy in a war zone.
That's what you do.
That's what you do.
That's Micah Garen, a documentarian, journalist, and friend. He's agreed to come onto the show and talk with me about the 10 days during that summer that he was held hostage. Since co-authoring the book American Hostage, a memoir of a journalist kidnapped in Iraq, and the remarkable battle to win his release, this is the first interview he's given about the ordeal. And for this, I'm incredibly grateful. American Hostage tells the story of Micah's abduction from 2 points of view: his, and that of his partner, now wife, Marie-Helene Carlton, who, with a cohort of friends and family, moved heaven and earth to secure his release. It's good. Read it. But this episode is not about the book. It's about Micah, a man who for 10 days looked death in the face, and how it has affected his life ever since. Please join me for episode 5 of The Adventures of Memento Mori, Escaping Death.
From the Maida Creative Company, this is The Adventures of Memento Mori, a seeker's guide for learning to live by remembering to die. The podcast that explores mortality. Here's your host, D.S. Moss.
Micah Garen and Marie-Helene Carlton are a filmmaking wonder team who had spent months filming a documentary about the archaeological looting of Iraq because of the war. The filming had come to an end. Almost. All but a couple of interviews and potentially dangerous contextual B-roll shots.
It's funny because when you're in these situations, or when you're doing a project where there's elements of it that are dangerous, are dangerous, you always tend to put those off to later.
With the reassurance from Micah, Marie-Helene went home while he stayed for a couple more days to get those shots.
And it's only in those last moments, I always warn other filmmakers and journalists about this, don't do what you put off to the last couple of days. Just don't ever do it. Because psychologically, you put off the most dangerous things until the last few days. And you don't realize that, but you don't do them earlier because they're so dangerous.
On Friday, the 13th of August, 2004, Micah, accompanied with his friend and interpreter, Amir, went to a market just outside of Nasiriyah to discreetly capture footage of gun sellers at the market. Just a few background shots of a gun market. After a cautious approach, Micah and Amir gained enough trust from one of the gun sellers and nervously began filming. They moved on to the next vendor. But something about this one didn't feel right to Micah, so he kept a small digital camera in his pocket and out of sight. Amir assured Micah it was okay to film, and against his instincts, he took a picture. The vendor instantly reacted, shouting and causing a scene. He wanted that non-existent roll of film out of the back of that digital camera. The crowd gathered, unsatisfied and now enraged. The vendor loaded a rifle and shot at Amir's feet. Then, with a finger on the trigger, pointed the barrel directly at Micah.
My immediate thought was, you can see this situation escalating around you. And my thought was, de-escalate. Let's get out of here. Let's kind of move away. I could see where this was suddenly gonna get out of hand.
With the gun still pointed at him, Micah turns around quickly and begins to walk away.
It was only when I was walking away and I was a little bit further from the action that somebody had kept an eye on me and sort of caught up with me and asked me what was wrong. And I said, ma baraf, which, I don't know. But my accent and the fact that it wasn't, colloquial Iraqi Arabic, he immediately was just, just started shouting foreigner. He had caught the foreigner.
The crowd turned angry mob, grab and pull at Micah, tearing at his clothes, taking his wallet and his glasses. With a knife to his throat, he's led to a car and thrown into the back seat along with Amir. The driver and passengers were both armed and is as frantic as those outside of the car door.
There's multiple moments when you're sort of thinking, oh God, this could be the end, because this man was really agitated. He was screaming. He was pointing the pistol back at us. And then, they took us to this small office, which was the solder office right along the river, which is only about a 5-minute drive. And there, we thought, okay, de-escalate, explain who we are. We're filmmakers, we're journalists. My interpreter, Amir, told me afterwards that they were having a conversation between themselves, and one of them said, should I get the pistol? Basically meaning, should we just take them out and shoot them? And the other guy said, well, no, they might be telling the truth about, being journalists. So, there are multiple stages where things kept getting worse and worse and worse. And that's when they put the blindfold on us. And that's when they put us in the car and took us for a couple hours.
Sitting with their hands tied behind their backs and blindfolded head resting on their knees, Micah and Amir are driven away, leaving no traces behind.
This question of constantly going on in my head of, am I going to fight? Am I going to negotiate? Am I going to plead? What are you going to do? Which strategy is the one that's going to get you out of the situation?
So at one point you had your arms tied behind your back and you had loosened the knots, right. And then you were feeling behind you and you felt what you thought could be rifles, but instead it was just the barrels of the rifle.
Right.
And then there was an opportunity, or at least you thought possibly there was an opportunity to then take the barrel of that rifle and then do something with it to the passenger and the driver. So now you're in contemplating fight mode.
This is definitely, it's the kind of thing, I'm not in any way trained to fight. It's not something I've ever done. So the concept of fighting in that capacity is it's not a real option.
It's almost like based on movies, right?
It's based on movies, but it's a sense of, if this is your last option, if this is the only thing left to you, is to take, this piece of metal that's in my hand and to swing and hit at somebody, I could do that. But the question in my head was that, we talk about escalate and de-escalate. That escalates things, because if you're going to hit them,
you got to make sure
follow through.
You got to do it 100%. Yeah, and
that escalates it, 1,000 times, and it's all or nothing. And this is the real crux, the terrible thing about being kidnapped in this situation, is you don't know what's coming, and you're trying to guess at what's coming. Is what's coming worse than, which is the worst path to go on? If you know that they're about to shoot you, well then, yeah, you're going to pick up that metal rod and hit somebody. But if they're going to release you in an hour, you've just signed over your death warrant.
Imagine that for a minute. You've been violently abducted, blindfolded, and now are in the backseat of a van heading to your end. Or Freedom, perhaps. You don't know. Do you take that swing?
Is there a way out of this? How do I get out of this? Is this an opportunity to escape? Is this going to, lead to my death? For the next 10 days, that's what I was wrestling with every minute of the day.
Hello, fellow provocateurs who believe death is a topic worth talking about. We need your help spreading the word. Be the slightly odd yet endlessly fascinating conversationalist at your next party and tell your friends about the Adventures of Memento Mori. Want to stay in the loop? Join our inner circle by going to our site, theadventuresofmementomori.com, and be sure to stay up to date with the quest for enlightenment on YouTube by following our channel, The Adventures of Memento Mori podcast. And now, back to the show.
It's still Friday, August 13th. Micah, only a few short days from returning home, now finds himself traveling for hours in the backseat of a van with his hands behind his back, the right grasping the cold metal barrel of an AK-47. Following the advice of Amir, Micah decides not to take that swing. And so, they continued to drive. Kidnapping and killing of Iraqis became a problem after the coalition pulled back earlier that year, and video executions of foreigners were a weapon of choice for insurgents trying to terrorize and influence policy. The public beheading of journalist Daniel Pearl and the hanging of contractor Nick Berg were fresh in everyone's mind. If these were militants, it would be a very public and grisly end. The van finally stopped. 2 armed guards led Micah and Amir, barefoot and blindfolded, across the field into a small, dark, dense natural enclosure made of date palm trees. This would be their prison.
I tried to write a message, which was MH for Marie Helene, Zug for our dog Zugma, and then love. And I used a reed and mud to write it on the back of a cigarette pack and then put it in my pocket. And, that's a message. That message was meant as a way of, I guess in essence, sort of speaking beyond the dead if I was killed. So, I think one of the hardest things for people in these situations is that you don't know, what's happening to the other person, what they were thinking. As I came to understand through this whole experience is that in a sense it's a lot worse for the people on the outside than it was for me. You're a pawn and you're meant to inflict pain on everyone else out there.
For the next 5 days, an anxious pattern formed. The ritual of meals, guard changes, and the constant insecurity of not knowing what would happen next.
So it's nonstop.
Yeah.
It's your brain goes into like 30-second mode where your whole world collapses to basically 30 seconds. And all you're doing for the next, for me it was 10 days, is over and over again, what's going to happen in the next 30 seconds? Is there a way out of this? How do I get out of this? Is this an opportunity to escape? Is this going to, lead to my death? Everything is just trying to weigh these options.
On the 5th day of captivity, everything changed.
In the morning, they just took me without warning, separated me from Amir. They just told me to come with them. There were a couple of them with guns, and then they led me to a small building that was maybe about a 5-minute walk from where we were being held. And that building, they had set it up just as you imagined it, basically a stage set for an execution, with a camera and about a dozen men standing around with, AKs, and I think one had an RPG. So they had set it up, in that way.
And they were wearing hoods, or were they just...
There was at least... Some of them had their faces covered, but there were at least a few that didn't. And that was obviously very worrying. When somebody doesn't cover their face, it makes you think that
they're not worried about you seeing them.
Exactly.
This is the moment that you think it's over.
It was almost, 2 things going on in my head. One was, a sense of trying to send good feelings and messages to people out in the world, that calm of like, it's okay, everything's okay. Whatever happens, it'll be fine. Don't worry about me, everything's fine. That in a sense is you maybe it's a sense of acceptance, but that was half my brain, and the other half was, I'm not going down without a fight.
How does that translate into actual action? Is it do they neutralize each other?
Well, it's about becoming extremely calm and still. In these videos, I was used to two things happening. They usually came in pairs, at least up to that point. So one was the warning, and then the next was the execution. So a big part of me thought that maybe this was the warning video. So I was looking for clues as to whether or not this was an execution video, because if it was, then I was going to fight back. But so there was all this, back and forth in my own mind, like what's actually happening in this moment. Because, this is the thing, they don't tell you. They're not coming in and saying.
And this is happening. We've been talking about this thing for 5 minutes, but this is like literally like in a 10-second span.
Yeah, it's very quick.
Yeah.
It's very quick. And you hardly have time to process what's going on around you. But I had actually, when I say fight back, I mean, in the other half of my brain, I had fashioned a little shiv from sharp palm fronds. And that was in my shoe at the moment. So. And
so you were thinking, at what point do I reach down and.
I was going to grab that and.
Someone's jugular.
Again, it's not something I've ever done, and I'm not something I've ever been trained to do. So, God knows, obviously it's not going to work, but that was the state of mind.
So it ultimately was the warning video.
Yeah.
And so take me through that relief process, just that relief.
There's not much relief because it was an intense sense of anger and humiliation. Because what I was realizing is that suddenly I had been used, and that this video that they're making is being used as, a way of hurting people out in the world. They want to create intense fear, particularly in my family. And that was the purpose. I was basically being used as a weapon against the rest of the world and my family. So that was, there really wasn't so much of a feeling of relief. It was a feeling of deep anger and humiliation.
Here, I guess here's a moral question that I just thought of. So at the point now you're angry at them, you feel humiliated. Did that change your moral stance on even, if you had a chance to kill them? Now you're a journalist and you are neutral, right, and you're trying to tell an empathetic story about archaeology and about a country,
right,
that America invaded, and now you've been brought in, and now you're a part of it. And so did your empathy at that point just go out the door, and you're like, at any point,
yeah,
don't turn your back, don't give me a chance, because I will now. I'm so angry that I will kill you. That
idea of attacking somebody, killing somebody, is not in my nature or vocabulary. So it's a very, as you're moving closer and closer to that as your option, it's definitely surreal. And it's, I would have to say, what's in your mind may or may not be something that you actually can ever act on.
Right.
For the next 2 days, Micah's urge to escape was constant. He and Amir were bonded together as brothers, yet consensus between them never allowed for the right opportunity. And then, like before, without notice, the guards grabbed Micah and led him to the house for the second video. I asked Micah what was going through his mind as he approached the building.
And no idea. And again, that was, the whole, I'm going to have to fight my way out of this. This is the only way at this point. But I don't even think at that point I thought that was a real option anymore. I think you kind of get closer and closer to the thought of, well, maybe I'm not, I really am not in control, and I can't control my fate. And so that was probably one of the moments where, still to this day, I probably, of all the 10 days, I have the hardest time understanding what I was actually thinking in that moment as I was walking into that for the second time. It's a bit of a blank. I actually, I can't really remember what was going through my mind.
And then as you walk through the threshold of the door,
it was pretty clear immediately that, when they brought me into the room, that this was not going to be an execution video. The reason it was obvious is because the way they had set it up, it was looked like a living room. Same building, just,
So they did set deck?
Yeah, set dressing. They're sending messages to the world. They're sending carefully thought out messages.
And this message was?
This is a message that they wanted me to read. So they had written it out in sort of, bad handwriting and broken English, but they wanted me to read this message. But they actually wanted me to memorize it and say it. And it was, demanding that the U.S. pull forces out of Najaf, So that was the message I was supposed to give. And at that point, again, when you're fighting back in little ways. And so for me, at that moment, fighting back was by just throwing in the words, "I've been asked to read, to deliver this message."
And did they
didn't catch that.
From there, Micah and Amir were moved several times over the next few days. Each time they were moved, there were fewer and fewer guards.
And at one point, it was just Amir and myself and these two young guards sitting out on a rug out in the middle of the night, somewhere, God knows where. And there was one AK-47, and it was equidistant between me and that guard. And I looked over at Amir, and I looked back down at that, and he just kind of shook his head. And, at that point again, he thought things were going to be okay.
So countless opportunities that,
if you call them opportunities,
or decisions,
countless decisions, and in a way that was, that was the crazy torment, because you tried to figure out, is that something you should do?
So you bounce from place to place.
Yeah.
And then you finally end up
back where I started, back in the solder office. That's where we were released, back into a press conference.
So, spoiler alert, Micah lived through it. But how does a traumatic event like this affect someone? Does it change the way they look at life? We ask Micah about this exact thing after this.
Do you consider yourself to be a fellow seeker? Do you believe there's something more to being human than what's available in the illusory cocoon of our material world? Or perhaps you're thinking of starting an existential scavenger hunt and would like a guidebook to help chart your path? If yes, you're in luck. Go to theadventuresofmementomori.com and sign up to receive D.S. Moss's upcoming book, Something to Believe in, a seeker's guide to finding your big belief. Sign up today and start your journey.
And so another part of this is, how has it affected you now, and specifically affected you in living? The cliche would be, I have looked into the eyes of death and I've survived, and each day I appreciate and will live to its fullest.
This is a question that comes up a lot, actually, in my own mind, is when you get into a situation like that where you come close to dying, potentially. In one sense, my situation is different than the kind of cliche of, I'm going to change my life, because I was in that moment doing exactly what I had always wanted to do. I was in Iraq working on a documentary film about archaeology. That was it. That was, in a sense, that was my life dream. So if you die doing your life dream, what's there to change? But what did impact me in a huge way was this near-death experience was something that was felt profoundly by everyone else out in the world. The rest of the world was made to feel this loss, probably more than I was. And, when I got out, it took a long time to sort of process this. I was completely overwhelmed, just inundated with messages from people I hadn't talked to in 15 years in high school. Just the amount, the impact, kind of the love and care and concern from the world was something I wasn't expecting and wasn't used to.
Soon after he returned, Micah was at a party in the West Village, and a stranger came up to him and asked him, "Wow, that was a really incredible experience. You must have been saved for something greater."
And I, thought about that. I was like, well, I hope so. I didn't know what to make of that, because there's this enormous pressure on you that if you survive that, you're going to do something profound. You're going to walk on water.
Yeah, that you have been spared
for something tremendously important. I think that's, what's tremendously important is understanding what you care about in your life and to try to make sure that you're living that. And that's an ongoing process. That's a difficult process. I mean, coming back to that realization of what matters in your life. Are you doing the things that are important? I don't know. I think it's a constant question.
So 10 days, your adrenaline is being maxed out.
Yeah.
And post, you've gone back, and you go back to really the most dangerous areas of conflict that there's been. So do you find it actually hard? I mean, I wouldn't say things like adrenaline junkie or addicted to danger, things like that, but I think you've been elevated. Is it hard to come down and be like, the world, our container now is kind of silly? Like, because you've seen and you go into high risk situations, and now, like, are you in the waiting for the fucking C train and be like, whatever?
Well, it is a challenge, because in a conflict or post-conflict zone, there is a heightened sense of importance around everything. And you come back to New York and the environment here of, like, picking up your milk. It's hard to feel a sense of importance that compares to what you feel in those environments. So that it's not the adrenaline, it's the sense of meaning. And a lot of times I say to myself, that's a bit of an illusion.
The sense of meaning, or the picking up the milk?
No, the sense of meaning in those environments. It's not necessarily intrinsic meaning. It's meaning that's created from that conflict environment. And so I always, talk myself down from that sense of meaning, and I try to look for the intrinsic meaning, because, there's just as much meaning in a William Carlos Williams poem. There's just as much meaning as, in this cup of coffee sitting on the table. And you have to find that meaning wherever you are. And that conflict environment is an easy way to find meaning. It's so heightened. Everything is life or death.
But that seems like almost the harder practice is to find the meaning in the cup of coffee on the table.
It is. It's incredibly hard. I mean, and that's more difficult. And I think that's, in a way, this, these conflict zones can be a bit of, escapism for people. For me, this conflict is something that I had never, documenting, and nothing I had ever planned to do. And, after we've been at war for, almost 15 years now, I'm pulling myself out of that more and more and trying to focus more on the subtleties and beauty of life and art and the William Carlos Williams poem and the coffee cup, because in the end, that's what really matters.
I've since started reading a lot of William Carlos Williams. Thanks for joining me on another episode of The Adventures of Memento Mori. Thanks, Micah, for your friendship and sharing your story. In case you forgot, the book is American Hostage, a memoir of a journalist kidnapped in Iraq and the remarkable battle to win his release. Read it. Please visit our website at remembertodie.com and follow us on the social media at Remember to Die. I'm D.S. Moss. Back in 2 weeks for the next episode with more The Adventures of Memento Mori.
The episode was produced by Josh Heilbrenner, D.S. Moss, and Hannah Beale. Theme music composed by Mikey Ballou. This has been a production of the Maida Creative Company. Until next time, keep seeking.